Today we'll be reviewing a high-stakes cash game played between LLinusLLove and Dan Jungleman Case. This game comes from the Triton series in Montenegro and explores two divergent paths for playing weak pairs, which is one of the most frequently encountered segments in the game of poker and also one of the most difficult to navigate.
Too good. He's gonna say nice things about everyone. I want the commentary to say some bad things about people too.
So say bad thing about other people, say good thing about you.
Yeah.
So the blinds are 2K, 4K with a 4K big blind ante and an 8K straddle. Linus opens the action in the low jack with pocket 8s, bumping it up to 20K euros. For this sim, we'll be using Range Converter's 100 Big Blind PokerMaster solutions with a straddle and an ante, and we see that pocket 8s are clear open. However, I should note that this solution assumes a larger open at 3.5x the straddle, so with Linus's smaller open, you could expect him to have somewhat of a wider range here.
Is that too much to ask?
Definitely the best considered commentator. Absolute legend. Gotta give him some props.
That's right. Him make.
Jungleman is next to act in the hijack and he flats with pocket 5s. Here we see that pocket 5s are borderline call in this spot. The ante does encourage calling with wider range on the one hand, but on the other hand the straddle cuts the effective stack in half, thus significantly reducing the implied odds necessary for set mining. However, given that Linus opens smaller than the opening size for this solution, calling with pocket 5s may be the preferred option. Interestingly, the solver is also flatting with a number of its stronger pocket pairs as well. Not quite sure why that is, but it may be a side effect of the straddle causing the raise sizings to be multiples of typical sizings in a standard game. This in turn may cause the solver to lean more towards cold calling instead of raising, and so also calling with some stronger pairs will help protect the rest of its calling range. However, given Linus's smaller sizing, I'm going to make a few adjustments to this range to reduce the frequency of some of these overpairs calling, and also to add in a bit more calling with some of these suited combos.
Russian accent. When we were playing Super Bowl. Oh yeah? He was doing a Russian accent?
Linus opening, 20,000.
The other guy, Alinizader.
Yeah.
What is his name?
Who got Russian accent?
Huh?
Who?
They were like, when we were playing Super Bowl in Vegas, they were making a Russian accent, you know, when it comes to me. So they were always like, making it fun. I liked it.
The flop comes 9-7-6 rainbow and Linus checks. And we see that Pio is checking the vast majority of its range here as well. This middling connected board, to a certain extent, negates the pre-flop aggressor's advantage in overpairs, since there are possible made straights on the board, and the pre-flop caller's range should be quite tight and centered around pocket pairs and suited connectors, encompassing all of the sets and a number of straights and two pairs. Accordingly, playing out of position and likely at a slight range disadvantage on a very dangerous board, Linus should be doing a lot of checking here, even though his hand is relatively strong with second pair and the open-ended straight draw.
Nick's Russian accent was pretty good.
So that. Production guy also don't need to sleep.
When we play
So Lulliger,
tomorrow?
close to open-ender, is going to check it over to Jungleman here. Jungleman is going to expect Lulliger to give up a lot here.
Itching.
Jungleman decides to make a small 31% pot bet with his pocket 5s. Given that Jungle is in position and this board is likely slightly more favorable to the pre-flop caller, we see that Pio is betting most of its range. However, it is doing a decent amount of checking as well, including with a higher percentage of pocket 5s. This may partially be in recognition of the possible straights in both players' ranges, which crams down the equities of the other holdings, and also the fact that Linus's range should still be mostly uncapped despite his check. Right, a check is often viewed as an indication of weakness, and it sometimes is. However, before making any decision, it is important to first define the villain's range, which requires you to put yourself in villain's shoes and assess what his action tells you about his range. In this situation, since the board is not favorable to Linus against a pre-flop cold caller in position, he should have been checking most, if not all of his range, even with his most nuttish holdings such as straights, sets, and overpairs. In other words, Linus's check does not indicate weakness or really define his range at all, so proceeding with some caution makes sense. That being said, we see that checking and betting small produce very similar EV for all of the combos in Jungle's range, and pocket fives could use protection from various runouts, and is likely ahead a good portion of Linus's range, so taking either action here should generally be okay.
With hands like ace queen, takes a stab at it. Exactly the reason why this is a good spot for the eights to check. It's very easy to just check call.
Linus calls, and we see that the solver is primarily just calling with eights as well. I think some in this spot may be inclined to raise here with the pair and open-ended straight draw, and we do see that the EVs between checking and raising are close, so either play should generally be fine. However, given that pocket eights have substantial showdown value, opting to raise essentially transforms this holding into a bluff, which may not be advisable given that at the end of the day, Linus has second pair, which is a hand that generally does not want to play a huge pot, since it should be ahead of most of, though not all of, Jungle's range. In contrast, we see that the solver does fire off a raise with higher frequency with these open-ended straight draws that are not made hands, as well as a number of 10x holdings that are on the higher end of the gut shot. And for value, the solver is raising with a number of his stronger top pairs, overpairs, and sets.
Most likely twice as well. He hits a straight. Jungleman might be tempted to represent.
The turn brings the 10 of diamonds, completing Linus's straight, and he checks, which we see the solver is doing with its entire range. Although Linus obviously has a very strong hand here, this card overall is somewhat neutral or possibly more advantageous to Jungle, so there is no strong justification to donk after Jungle's bet on the flop.
The 8 himself.
我打给他。早就走了。
Doesn't that just like
Represent the straight, he will.
Jungle continues with a 51% pot bet, and although we see that the solver is doing quite a bit of betting, it is not betting really at all with pocket fives. And this, I think, is a good example of why weak pairs may be the most difficult segment to play in poker, because the optimal strategy for these holdings can span the spectrum of actions depending on the context. Right, in certain circumstances, weak pairs can be bet for value and or protection. Other times, weak pairs simply want to pot control and get to showdown. And then in other instances, weak pairs want to bluff in an attempt to steal the pot. So how do we determine the optimal strategy for our weak pairs in any given scenario? Well, I've personally developed my own system of analysis, which I've been planning to release for free once the product I've been working on for the past few months is launched. However, development has taken much longer than anticipated, and I keep getting requests for coaching, which unfortunately I do not have time for currently, so I'm going to give you guys a sneak peek at my system. Simply put, at each decision point, I assess the game at 3 levels with increasing granularity. The first level is the macro analysis, where we analyze the overall tendency for the entire range. The second level is the Meso Analysis, where we categorize our hand based on its likelihood to win at showdown. And the third level is the micro analysis, where we examine the specific characteristics of our hand, such as blockers, unblockers, and draws. I analyze hands this way in sequence for 2 primary reasons. One, it simplifies the game, since there are many scenarios where we can make decisions at the higher levels of abstraction without drilling down to the more specific levels, while still retaining most of the EV from the GTO solutions. And 2, for our more complex decisions, it provides a systematic framework of analysis where each level informs the next level, leading to a final decision that takes into account all of the most important factors instead of haphazardly focusing on one factor or another. I'm not going to get into all the details in this video, but to provide an overview, The macro analysis focuses on three things: range advantage, position, and SPR. And we examine all of these factors along one dimension, whether they increase or decrease aggression. To take this hand as an example, with a 10 on the turn, this board appears to be somewhat advantageous to the preflop caller, who should have a higher proportion of the strongest holdings available. However, on the other hand, Linus's range should also have all the strongest possible combos here as well, including a number of straights on this polarizing board. So taking that into account, as well as the fact that Jungle is in position, a mixed strategy which leans towards betting for the overall range is justified. After we have established that the range should be mixing its strategy, we then drill down to the Meso Analysis, where we attempt to classify our hand based upon its likelihood to win at showdown, since each class has its own unique tendencies. To assess Hero's likelihood to win, it is necessary to approximate his hand's rank vis-a-vis the distribution of the villain's range given the board and prior actions. Some people attempt to do this by constructing both players' entire ranges and counting combos, but I find this very difficult, if not impossible, to do when there are time constraints. Additionally, I think there is also a bit of a false premise concern when you start to count specific combos, because the reality is we don't know our opponent's exact range, especially when they are playing a mixed strategy. So personally, to simplify analysis in a manner that I can execute real time, I evaluate hand classes in a much more abstract way by focusing on four broad categories: nuttish holdings, mid-strength hands, showdownable hands, and non-showdownable hands. In this case, given Linus's raise preflop and check call on the turn, his nuttish holdings likely consist of straights, sets, and two pairs. His mid-strength hands on this highly connected board are likely overpairs and some top pairs. His showdown hands are likely weaker pairs and some stronger ace highs, and his non-showdown hands are everything else. In that context, pocket fives likely fall within Linus's distribution of showdownable hands. And after we have identified our hand class, the next step is to consider the predominant tendencies for that class. Generally speaking, the solver has two predominant tendencies when it comes to showdownable hands. One, pot control to get to showdown, or two, bet for protection or value. All other things being equal, the solver will typically default to pot controlling and getting to showdown with this class unless there are compelling incentives to bet. In this case, there is no reason to bet for value given that a bet has already been placed on the flop, and there are very few, if any, holdings in Linus's range that are behind and that would call another bet on this board, other than some flush draws, many of which actually have higher equity than pocket fives here. Additionally, protection is not that significant of a concern relative to the flop, since there's only one card to come, and Jungle's pocket fives are already behind most of Linus's range, which mitigates the value of protection. So taking that into account, following the more conservative path by simply checking behind in an attempt to realize equity and to avoid the risk of reopening the action does make sense. And we see that out of Jungle's entire range, pocket fives have the strongest affinity to checking. So if Jungle is checking any portion of his range here, which we've determined from the macro analysis he should be doing, pocket fives is a prime candidate. By betting here, Jungle is essentially turning his hand into a pure bluff, but according to the solver, turning this hand into a bluff is a bit premature at this stage, since Jungle should be ahead of a number of combos in Linus's range, such as ace-kings or broadways with a backdoor flush draw, some of which may be content to also try to get to showdown depending on the river.
48,000.
I love to be playing with the flags.
Great news for Linus.
I wish they were just regular chips. I wish they were just regular chips.
No, I mean it actually makes the game special. You know,
Yeah.
you get in this feeling that it's actually a big bet if you bet in with the flags.
That's true. I don't know. I played with $100,000 chips.
Linus calls with his straight, and we see that the solver is mixing its play between calling and raising with pocket eights, as well as the rest of the range. On the one hand, a straight is at the top of the equity distribution, so Linus should want to grow the pot as large as possible, but on the other hand, the straight does not need much protection, and raising on a very polarizing board will likely fold some of Jungle's value combos and draws. And when there are conflicting factors that lead to a mixed decision for a particular segment of hands, we then drill down to the microanalysis to analyze the specific characteristics of our holding to help guide our decision. So in this case, we see that the solver is choosing to raise with nearly all of its pocket eights holding a diamond, and to simply call with all of its pocket eights without a diamond. I've seen spots similar to this one on a number of occasions where the solver will tend to prefer to bet a strong combo holding one suit that matches a flush draw on the board, despite the fact that it is impossible for the hero to complete the flush. I'm not 100% sure why this is the case, but it may be because it decreases the probability of the flush draws in villain's range from hitting, which ameliorates some of the risk inherent with bloating the pot with a raise or bet when your opponent is drawing. However, I should note that although the discrepancies in frequencies is stark among these different combos, the EV differences between raising and checking are quite close, and this encapsulates why the microanalysis is always the last level of examination, because one of its core functions is to nudge us towards one action or another only when the cumulative factors from the macroanalysis and the meso-analysis advise a mixed strategy.
That still feels big. I mean, this same, you're playing I don't know, like 5k USD tournament, and you have in the same 1k chip, or 100, you said 100k chip.
Yeah.
And with the plugs is different. When we're playing in Macau, I like to, if you cover in all the table,
Linus checks it again.
From that point, it doesn't really matter how much you have if you cover in everyone. So
This point,
I like to
it's
build
most suspect that he has more than just a high card hand.
flags.
Maybe we get Bobby in.
And just
He's drunk.
That sounds unlikely.
No,
But
not yet.
wonderful.
Still a great spot.
Bobby, you want a seat? Now that I'm
Still
firing.
applause.
No?
Will he fall for it?
No, Bobby's not coming. Too smart.
Yeah, I
He's
guess
too smart for you guys.
he's not really keen to play with young kids.
200,000 in the middle.
Every once in a while.
At least I didn't lose money to the pros. You know,
Every
to the
once in a
pure
while,
pros, right?
Right?
I didn't lose the money to the pure pros. Lose him and me.
Yeah, it's nice. The biggest winners at the table, probably.
He likes it too.
It's nice. He's a nice guy. You're a good man. You're good. That's most important in life. Luck and health. What else can we do? So it's good. It's nice.
But you also need
If I win, then I shout. If I lose, I'm quiet.
144,000.
The river is the king of hearts, Linus checks, and Jungle completes his bluff with a 76% pot bet. Here we see that the solver is indeed bluffing with fives, mixing between this size and shoving. But finding equilibrium, didn't you just say that pocket fives has showdown value and therefore should want to pot control and get to showdown? Well, yes I did, but that was in the context of a different game state. Although it may seem cumbersome to some, this is why I use the same systematic analysis protocol at each and every decision point. From a macro perspective, the king is generally more favorable to Linus, but on the other hand, taking into account the context of the entire board and prior actions, Jungle is projecting a polarized range consisting of straights, sets, and air, which should still want to bet despite the king. And from the meso-analysis perspective, given Linus's call on the flop and turn and the king on the river, the likelihood of pocket fives continuing to have showdown value is quite remote. Right, when we consider which hands in Linus's range pocket fives are ahead of at this point, the list is rather sparse. There are some flush draws that missed that Jungle may have been ahead of on the turn, but many of those flush draws contain a king. Right, if the river instead had been, for example, a deuce, we see that the solver would actually check behind because there would still be at least a moderate number of combos in Linus's range, primarily consisting of broadways, that pocket fives would beat at showdown. And if we compare Linus's range on the turn and river, we see quite a dramatic difference in composition, particularly at the bottom of the range, because most of Linus's weaker hands should have folded to Jungle's turn bet or perhaps donked on the river. So given the prior action and the river runout, downgrading Jungle's pocket fives from the showdown value class to the non-showdown value class is appropriate, since he is now ahead of very few combos in Linus's range, and as we all know, the primary tendency for non-showdown hands is to bluff.
In the middle.
A nice hand. Okay.
by Jungleman. Gunslinger from America. Yeah, he's gonna get an easy call from Linus. Gets the
Come on,
bad
show for
news.
show.
478,000 euros.
77.
So Linus simply calls, and we see that the solver is raising 100% of its pocket eights, which is near the very top of Linus's range. The only possible combos that have him beat here are Jack 8 and Queen Jack, and the former is heavily blocked by Linus's pocket eights. So what is Linus thinking here? Well, if I had to guess, after constructing Jungleman's range, Linus may have concluded that the likelihood of Jungle taking this line with a value combo that Linus was ahead of, but that would also call a shove, was very low. Right? I think there are many people that would check behind in Jungle's shoes, even with a set, due to the dangerous board, and of course there is no point in Linus raising against a bluff. However, at least according to the solver, some of Jungle's sets should have taken this line and also called a raise. So in this video, we took a very deep dive exploring one of the most difficult segments to navigate in the game of poker, weak pairs. Weak pairs are particularly tricky because they are highly sensitive to different actions and board runouts, which can cause these holdings to shift between different hand classes, which in turn greatly affects strategies. As such, using a systematic and structured approach to analysis at each decision point, which takes into account all prior actions on the board, is an absolute necessity to approximate the optimal path at each given game state. So that's the video for today. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay balanced.